Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So I'm so excited to have you here today to just talk about our favorite topic of B2B and how does thought leadership really help be a key differentiator for B2B, but in particular talk about how we're here at Cannes, right? And it's amazing. I hope you're having a good Cannes so far. It's going well.
It's been great so far, yeah.
Awesome. And we're here to talk about creativity, of course. And in B2B, it would not be Cannes without talking about creativity. And wanted to also talk a little bit about, obviously, you and I have worked for many years on some research around the impact of thought leadership in B2B marketing. LinkedIn has recently released our B2B marketing benchmark report, so a lot of great information came out recently, and so figured we could just spend some time to chat.
That's great.
Cool. We are, I think, at this starting point of creativity in B2B, and so this idea of creativity and this inspirational piece that can happen, I think we're just starting to begin to see that in B2B. And so, given your vast experience, I would love to get your thoughts of how creativity in B2B can be inspirational, can be thought-provoking, and what it can do.
So I think now this is the second year of B2B Lions here at the Cannes Festival,
right. Yeah.
and this is my first time here, but certainly one of the big things that jumps out at me is that a lot of times in B2B, whether it's executives, marketers, what have you, we tend to sort of think about things like thought leadership and content and in very and sometimes sort of very rigid ways, I guess.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that jumped out at me is just the role of creativity and how a great piece of content or social media or whatever it might be absolutely plays a role in driving thought leadership and in driving those kinds of ideas. Mm-hmm. And that we shouldn't just confuse, thought leadership for the format, right? Thought leadership can materialize in a lot of different ways. It doesn't just have to be a white paper.
Yeah.
It doesn't, only have to be a research report. It's very much a yes and so, as you said, I think we're sort of in the early stages of, B2B brands, really adopting creativity in that way.
Definitely, and I think it's the magic of storytelling, right? And how do we think about, let's figure out the story first, and then the formats will come later, and they will come in a bunch of different ways that we can do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, again, we're definitely at the infancy, I think, of that happening, but we're starting to see people do that. Do you have any companies you could think of that may have been starting to do that really well, is thinking about thought leadership and how they tell that story and so forth?
Well, one, and I'm not just saying this because we're here at LinkedIn and the Microsoft connection and all that, but I really, over the years, I really have admired the work that Microsoft has done around really bringing, insights from the workplace to the forefront. And, I know some of the really interesting reports that Microsoft began during the pandemic, really shining a light on sort of the different ways that various parts of the workforce kind of felt about everything that was happening, whether it was sort of the general employee population relative to the C-suite around a number of different topics. And I think it was genuinely important work, and I know that it's evolved over time, but also a really good example of just a very creative packaging and making that information sort of appealing and easy to digest, easy to share, but all underpinned with a lot of really great substance underneath it.
Yeah, so the workforce report, for myself, is a great piece. And it's interesting, as we were talking about creativity and we're talking about the storytelling, like Microsoft is a unique company that, yes, in full disclosure, we are owned by Microsoft, but they sit on such a unique set of information and data by being the underlying piece of almost every business in the world, right? And so, and whether it be through using Outlook as in your office or an office suite, or even LinkedIn and the information that we have, they sit in such a unique space of information they have that. They have that, and they thought about what's the story we can tell to help them during the pandemic, understanding workforce trends, understanding we all got into this pandemic having no idea, because it had been 100 years since when it happened, of what that means in the society. And so being able to use that as the forefront as they built out their strategy. So.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the data around the way different types of employees who know each other well versus those you might not collaborate with as frequently. All of that data that Microsoft has around how those types of cohorts within companies work together or not, I mean, it's like legitimately useful for thinking about company strategy, and especially now as we're in, or a lot of companies are at least are in more of a sort of hybrid mode. It's just super useful insights.
Totally. So I mentioned that LinkedIn recently launched the B2B marketing benchmark report, and we found that B2B leaders plan to invest more in higher proportions of their marketing budgets in brand building. And you could say thought leadership is some sort of forms of brand building that can exist. And so curious about your take of how thought leadership really does play into that.
Yeah, this seems to be one of the sort of eternal questions in B2B marketing, right? Brand and demand. And some people might say brand versus demand.
Yes.
And it seems, I mean, certainly just from conversations recently in the industry, it seems that a lot more leaders are really thinking about how those two are intertwined.
Yeah.
Right, and it's not just one at the expense of the other. And in fact, and certainly LinkedIn has a lot of data on this, but the more effectively that a brand can show up with a particular target audience, that actually helps to accelerate and amplify the effect of what you're doing on the demand side of things. And that is, I would say, especially true for companies that maybe don't have the luxury of being sort of number 1, 2, or 3 within their category.
Yeah.
It's absolutely critical to have that strong brand to actually enable the demand efforts to be effective. So absolutely, they're intertwined.
Yeah, totally. And I think the other thing we've seen is we've been mentioning for many years that there's this idea of this 95-5 rule, which is like 95% of your customer base is actually not in market, only 5% is the market. Well, we're actually seeing it right now, given economic conditions, is it's getting closer to a 99-1 rule, where we're seeing more and more people are out of market because they're just not ready to make a move on that. And so I was actually speaking with several people over the course of this week about this idea of right now the best brands, what they think about is, so I'm a racing fan, I'm a Formula 1 fan, and so you tend to do best in Formula 1 and racing if you're trying to take a lead or you're trying to move forward at the turns. And so brand building and getting to, so my analogy here is getting to this place of continuing to move forward is we are at a turn right now, and so we got to make sure we're accelerating and investing in the right places. And you got to be careful how you do it, right? Because if you make too much of a move, then it's going to oversteer or understeer. But there is an importance to figure out how you can do that and not just continue to focus on that small 1% that's right there right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great metaphor. And the other thing it makes me think of is if you're not particularly well known for, the particular thing that you want to engage your audience around, and we see this even with brands that, may be a leader or the leader in a category that they're really known for, but as we know, a lot of companies are now branching out into different areas, and they still need to build up that credibility and awareness around perhaps a new venture or a new area that they're focused on. And so it's just interesting. I know we've studied that in our past research reports, but it's interesting to see that same dynamic at play, because you could be one of the world's most well-known companies in one area, but you still need to think about the effect of brand and thought leadership if you're talking about other areas.
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's ways to figure out how to make sure you understand what your addressable market is, who you want to think about, and how to, I think people, especially in B2B, they're looking to be educated by companies, to be frank. And I think we're seeing a lot of this, and I'm curious on your take of this, that, it's not necessarily I need to be sold to, I need to be educated about what's going on. I want you to help me. And I think we found this in our report as well, of like, how can I, as a professional, I'm making an emotional decision when I purchase something. And I know this in B2B, like, you don't think of emotional decisions, but the reality is if I'm deciding I need a new product or service, or I'm bringing on a new vendor, that's a reflection of me and my career, right? And how that happens. And so as a B2B organization, I think part of it is helping your customer base understand what's just going on in the world. And I think the workforce report that you mentioned earlier is a great example of how Microsoft is just helping executives, HR professionals, anyone that's a professional understand what's happening right now.
So I was actually speaking with somebody recently who worked in their company's HR organization. They were looking at, evaluating different software platforms. And what you reminded me of is, how she was talking about just the length of time that they were planning on working with this potential partner.
Yeah.
And and even just the sort of the high value amount of the deal, but also just the length of time and the amount of really just thought that went into this kind of decision, because it's something that you do need to live with.
Yeah.
And it really, it just, to your point, it really was obvious that there was such a personal and professional kind of implication there. So the idea that B2B is less emotional is I've always been kind of confused by that, because and you and I use this example sometimes, right? Like if you sort of, buy the wrong kind of food or whatever, that's unfortunate, but you can move on with your life. But choosing the wrong partner that you might be stuck with for 3 years can really be a big deal. So emotion plays a huge role in it. And then I think the other thing, to your point about thought leadership and education, is right. Customers don't just want to be educated on your product. Like I think that's the mistake that maybe some companies tend to make. Customers really, they're hungry for knowledge around how they can solve a problem that is immediate and urgent to them, and it's got to be genuine, or else they'll tend to recognize right away if it's not.
Yeah, exactly. And going back, as we were talking about the emotional side, I think the other thing we see is the importance of brand and what I call the power of no, right? And so what I mean by that is, when you're making this emotional decision to purchase something for your job, it's a reflection of you to your boss, to your colleagues, to your executive team, things like that. And so one of the things is there's an importance of making sure when you're recommending something that the name of it's even just known, right? The brand is known. And I think about, like, for example, we talk with our executive team at LinkedIn, their power of no is, if we're recommending something, if we are the experts in what we're recommending, and that's how they view it. But if someone wants to say no, if an executive wants to say no, then it just immediately cuts it, right? And so making sure they know who the brands are that you're recommending and who the company is and who the service provider is really important. And that's why I think that brand building aspect is often overlooked at a lot of B2B organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Because why? I mean, there's a sort of old adage about nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, right?
Yeah.
And even just the company name aside, right? The underlying idea being that if a company is known and if they're trusted, that does a lot of that heavy lifting in terms of actually getting you into the conversation to be considered seriously. Otherwise, again, we talked about the professional impact potentially of choosing the wrong partners, choosing the wrong sort of B2B provider. Why would somebody sort of potentially risk their professional situation and go out on a limb for somebody that's not known at all? So just another example of how the brand really does have a strong role to play.
Definitely. And you mentioned, and I was hoping this would come up, trust, right? And trust companies. And I can't be with someone from Edelman and not talk trust, right? And so the other thing that I think in your trust report that has been coming out every year, one of the things that's been interesting is the amount people are trusting companies and relying on companies to get information, frankly. And I think that's even more true in B2B, right? I think in one of our reports together, we talked last year about this like newsroom aspect that exists, right? And so I think it's really interesting about how companies can utilize their efforts around thought leadership, around brand building, to help provide both trust and news to their customer base, if you will.
Yeah, honestly, I was a little bit surprised by some of the data points in our last study around that, and how, and I guess without getting sort of too deep into the detail, but this idea that there are a lot of industries where the level of the media coverage around some of those topics just tends to be pretty low, right? Because the publishing industry just has a tough time sort of monetizing around certain topics. But that doesn't mean that there's still not a lot of people that want to learn about certain issues within certain industries, and I don't know why I'm thinking about industrials. That might just be, one example.
That's what comes top of mind all the time.
Well, one vertical that comes to mind, but there's a lot of important stuff happening and a real hunger for knowledge, and we have seen companies actually step into sort of that vacuum, I guess, if you want to call it that, where there may not be a lot of media coverage, and companies have a great opportunity, again, if they do it in a genuine way.
Sure.
As long as it's not just talking about their products or services, but great opportunity for companies to kind of step into that kind of situation and fill that void.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, Joe, I know we could talk for hours as we usually do, but I think we're going to get kicked out of here soon. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure as always.
It was great to be here. Thanks.